Part 1, the breakdown. The rain hit her windshield like angry fists. Elena gripped the steering wheel tighter as her black BMW struggled up the winding mountain road. She should have listened to her assistant who warned her about taking this shortcut. But Elena always thought she knew better. That's how she'd climbed to the top of her advertising company in just 5 years. Now, sitting in the middle of nowhere with storm clouds getting darker by the minute, she wasn't feeling so smart. Her phone showed no signal. The fancy GPS that came with her luxury car had given up an hour ago, just showing a blank screen with the words, "Searching for route." The last town she'd seen was 3 hours behind her, and she hadn't passed another car in over an hour. Come on, she whispered to herself, pressing the gas pedal harder. The engine made a strange grinding noise that definitely wasn't normal. Elena had been driving for 12 hours straight, running away from the biggest disaster of her professional life. The Peterson account, worth $20 million, had fallen through because of her mistake. One wrong number in a presentation had cost her company millions and her reputation everything. She needed space to think, to figure out how to fix this mess. That's why she decided to drive to her college friend's cabin in Colorado instead of flying. She thought the long drive would clear her head. Instead, it was turning into a nightmare. The grinding noise got louder. Black smoke started coming from under the hood. No. Elena hit the steering wheel. Not now. But her car had other plans. The engine made one final dramatic cough and died completely. She managed to coast to the side of the narrow road before everything stopped working. She sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain pound on her roof. The storm was getting worse. Through her side window, she could see the road dropping off into a steep valley. On the other side, thick pine trees stretched up the mountainside like a dark green wall. Elena tried starting the car again. Nothing. Not even a click. She pulled out her phone and held it up, moving it around like some kind of magic wand. Still no signal. The battery was down to 15%. Perfect, she muttered. Just perfect. She'd left Chicago in her business clothes, a designer suit, heels, and a thin jacket that looked great in the office, but was useless against mountain weather. She had no food, no water, and no idea where she was. The temperature was dropping fast. She could see her breath when she exhaled. Elena had spent her whole adult life solving problems, making deals, and getting out of tough situations. But those skills meant nothing out here. She knew nothing about cars, nothing about mountains, and nothing about survival. She tried to think logically. Someone would come along eventually, right? This had to be some kind of road that people used. But as the minutes ticked by and no headlights appeared in either direction, that hope started fading. The storm was getting worse. Snow was starting to mix with the rain. After an hour of sitting in her dead car, Elena was getting seriously cold. Her hands were numb and she couldn't stop shivering. She knew she had to do something before hypothermia set in. That's when she saw it. Through the pine trees about half a mile up the mountainside, a thin line of smoke was rising into the gray sky. Someone was up there. Someone with fire and hopefully shelter. Elena looked at her high heels, then at the rocky, steep path that seemed to lead toward the smoke. This was going to be rough. She grabbed her purse and phone, locked her useless car, and started climbing. The path was barely visible, probably made by deer or other animals. Rock shifted under her feet and pine branches grabbed at her expensive suit. Within minutes, her heels were caked with mud and her stockings were torn. But Elena kept climbing. The alternative was spending the night in a freezing car, and that didn't seem like a plan that would end well. The smoke got closer. She could smell it now, wood burning, warm and inviting. Her heart started beating faster, partly from the climb and partly from hope. After what felt like forever, she saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines. The building looked solid and well-maintained, made of dark logs with a stone chimney. Warm yellow light glowed through the windows. Smoke drifted up from the chimney like a welcome sign, but Elena hesitated at the edge of the clearing. She was a city woman, alone, about to knock on the door of a stranger who lived in the middle of nowhere. Every crime show she'd ever watched told her this was a bad idea, but then a gust of wind cut through her thin jacket like a knife, and she made her decision. Freezing to death was definitely worse than whatever risk might be behind that door. She walked up to the cabin and knocked. Heavy footsteps approached from inside. The door opened, and Elena found herself face to face with the most intimidating man she'd ever seen. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a thick beard. His clothes were simple, flannel shirt, worn jeans, heavy boots, but it was his eyes that made her take a step back. They were gray like the storm clouds, and they seemed to look right through her. He didn't say anything at first, just studied her like she was some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. Elena realized how she must look: muddy, wet, clearly out of place in her city clothes. She probably looked like trouble. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "My car broke down on the road below. I saw you're smoking." She gestured helplessly. "I don't have any cell service, and it's getting really cold." The man continued to stare at her for what felt like a very long time. Elena could feel her teeth starting to chatter. Finally, he spoke. His voice was deep and rough, like he didn't use it very often. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "I know," Elena said quickly. "I made a mistake. Several mistakes, actually. I just need to use a phone or get warm for a while until the storm passes." He looked past her at the darkening sky, then back at her shivering form. She could see him thinking, weighing options. "I'm not a gentle man," he said suddenly, his voice carrying a warning that made her stomach clench. Elena's heart started beating faster for all the wrong reasons now. She took another step back, ready to run if she had to. But where could she go? Back to her dead car to freeze? The man seemed to understand her fear. Something shifted in his expression, not exactly kindness, but maybe something like regret. "But I'm not going to let you die out here either," he added. He stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. Elena stood at the threshold, torn between terror and relief. This stranger had just warned her that he wasn't gentle, but he was also offering her shelter from a storm that could kill her. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. Behind her, she heard him close the door against the wind and rain. Whatever happened next, at least she'd be warm. Part 2, the warning. The warmth hit Elena like a wall. After hours in the cold, the sudden heat made her dizzy. She stood just inside the door, dripping water on the wooden floor, trying to take in her surroundings. The cabin was bigger than it looked from outside. The main room had a stone fireplace with flames dancing behind a metal screen. Comfortable-looking furniture was arranged around it. A worn leather couch, 2 chairs, a coffee table made from what looked like a tree trunk. But what really caught her attention were the bookshelves. They covered almost every wall, packed with hundreds of books. This wasn't what she'd expected from a mountain hermit. The man who'd let her in was studying her again. Up close, she could see a scar running from his left temple down to his jaw. His hands looked rough, like they'd seen hard work. Everything about him suggested danger, but the cabin itself felt peaceful. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding toward her legs. Elena looked down. Her torn stockings were indeed spotted with blood from where rocks and branches had cut her during the climb. She hadn't even noticed. "I'll get the first aid kit," he said, then paused. "And some dry clothes." He disappeared into what she assumed was a bedroom. Elena stood awkwardly by the door, still dripping. She didn't want to move further into the cabin without permission. This man had warned her he wasn't gentle. She needed to be careful. When he returned, he was carrying a stack of clothes and a white metal box. "Bathroom's through there," he said, pointing to a door on the far side of the room. "Get changed first. Those wet clothes will make you sick." Elena took the clothes gratefully. They were clearly his. A flannel shirt that would be huge on her, thick socks and sweatpants with a drawstring waist. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Elena, by the way." He nodded but didn't offer his own name. The bathroom was small but clean. Elena caught sight of herself in the mirror and winced. Her hair was a mess, her makeup was smeared, and she looked like she'd been in a fight with a forest, which she supposed she had. She changed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs of clothes that were way too big. But they were warm and dry, and right now that was all that mattered. When she came back out, he had the first aid kit open on the coffee table. He'd also put a mug of something hot next to it. "Sit," he said, pointing to the couch. Elena sat and picked up the mug. It was coffee, strong and black, but it tasted like heaven. The warmth spread through her body, making her realize just how cold she'd been. "Give me your leg," the man said, kneeling in front of the couch with antiseptic and bandages. Elena hesitated. This felt too personal, too intimate. She barely knew this man. "I can do it myself," she said. He looked up at her with those gray eyes. "You can't see the cuts on the back of your legs," he had a point. and she was too tired to argue. Elena extended her leg, trying not to think about how strange this situation was. Yesterday she'd been in boardroom meetings. Now she was in a mountain cabin letting a mysterious stranger treat her wounds. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the cuts. Despite his warning about not being gentle, he was careful not to hurt her. "So what's your story?" Elena asked, partly to break the awkward silence and partly because she was genuinely curious. "Do you live up here alone?" "Yes, by choice?" He paused in his bandaging. "Yes." Elena waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Getting information from this man was like pulling teeth. "What do you do for work?" She tried again. "I don't work. Everyone works. Not everyone." He moved to her other leg, his touch still careful despite his rough appearance. "How do you afford to live? Food, supplies, all that?" He was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I saved money when I had a job. Now I don't need much. What kind of job?" Another long pause. "The kind that taught me to be careful around strangers." The way he said it made Elena's blood chill. What kind of job would teach someone that? Military? Police? Something worse? "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked quietly. He finished bandaging her leg and sat back on his heels, looking directly at her. "I told you I'm not a gentleman," he said. "I've done things that would probably scare you. I've hurt people. That's why I live alone now. That's why I tried to warn you." Elena's heart was beating fast again. "But you helped me." "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "But I'm not good company either. I don't know how to make small talk or be charming. I don't remember how to be around people who haven't seen the things I've seen." There was something raw in his voice, something that sounded like pain. "What things?" Elena asked softly. He stood up abruptly and started packing away the first aid supplies. "How long do you think the storm will last?" Elena asked, changing the subject when it was clear he wasn't going to answer. He looked toward the windows. Outside, the wind was howling, and snow was now falling heavily. Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. Mountain weather is unpredictable. Days? Elena's voice came out higher than she intended. She pulled out her phone to check for signal, forgetting that it was still dead. "There's no cell service up here," he said. "Closest tower is 40 miles away." Elena stared at her useless phone. Her boss would be expecting her call first thing Monday morning. She had meetings scheduled, deadlines to meet. Her whole carefully organized life was falling apart. "Hey," the man said, and his voice was gentler now. "You're safe here. The cabin's solid. I have plenty of food and firewood. You won't freeze or starve." "But I can't just disappear," Elena said, feeling panic rising in her chest. "People will be looking for me." "My job?" "What's so important about your job that you'd rather risk dying on a mountain road?" The question hit her like a slap. Elena realized she didn't have a good answer. Why had her job felt so important that she'd driven 12 hours through a storm? Why had she been running instead of facing her problems? "I messed up," she said quietly. "Made a mistake that cost my company millions of dollars. I was trying to figure out how to fix it. And you thought you'd find the answer on a mountain road in a storm?" When he put it like that, it sounded pretty stupid. "I needed space to think," Elena said defensively. "Well," he said, gesturing around the cabin, "you've got space now." Elena looked around the cabin again. The fire crackled peacefully. The book seemed to promise quiet hours, and for the first time in months she couldn't hear the constant buzz of the city. Maybe this wasn't such a disaster after all. Maybe this was exactly the space she needed. But she was still alone with a man who'd warned her he wasn't gentle. A man with scars and secrets who'd done things that would scare her. "What's your name?" Elena asked. He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to trust her with even that basic information. "Jake," he said finally. "Well, Jake," Elena said, settling back into the couch. "I guess we're going to be roommates for a while." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "I guess we are." Part 3. Reluctant sanctuary. Elena woke up to the sound of crackling wood and the smell of bacon. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she opened her eyes and saw the stone fireplace, the book-lined walls, and remembered everything. She was lying on the leather couch, covered with a thick wool blanket she didn't remember getting. Pale morning light filtered through the windows and the storm had finally stopped. "You're awake," Jake's voice came from across the room. Elena sat up, running her hands through her tangled hair. Jake was standing at a small kitchen counter, cooking breakfast on what looked like an old-fashioned gas stove. "What time is it?" she asked. "About 8. You were exhausted. Figured you needed the sleep more than conversation." Elena looked around the cabin properly for the first time. In daylight, she could see details she'd missed the night before. The books weren't just random collections, they were organized by subject. Philosophy, history, survival guides, literature. This wasn't just some guy hiding from the world. This was an educated man who'd chosen to live simply. The furniture was handmade but skillfully crafted. Everything in the cabin served a purpose, nothing was just for show. It was the opposite of her Chicago apartment, which was full of expensive things she'd bought because they looked good in magazines. "How do you live without internet?" Elena asked. Jake looked at her like she'd asked how he lived without poison. "Pretty easily. Books don't need Wi-Fi. Either does thinking." He brought her a plate of bacon, eggs, and toast along with a cup of coffee that smelled amazing. "This is incredible," Elena said after taking a bite. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "When you live alone, you either learn to cook or you eat terrible food forever." Elena laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed in weeks. "That's very practical." "Practical is how you survive out here." While she ate, Jake moved around the cabin doing morning tasks. He added wood to the fire, checked something outside through the window, and made notes in a small notebook. "What are you writing?" Elena asked. "Weather observations. Temperature, wind direction, cloud patterns. Helps predict what's coming." "You do that every day?" "Every day for 3 years. 3 years." Elena tried to imagine living alone for 3 years. No co-workers, no meetings, no constant buzz of city life. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked. Jake stopped writing and looked at her. "Lonely is different than alone." Before Elena could ask what he meant, he changed the subject. "Your car is going to need a new alternator and probably a radiator. Parts will have to come from Denver. How long will that take? Week, maybe 2. Depends on what they have in stock. 2 weeks. Elena's panic from the night before started creeping back. 2 weeks away from work, from her life, from everything that defined who she was. Is there any way to get a message to someone? Let people know I'm okay? Jake considered this. There's a radio in town. I go down for supplies once a month. Next trip was going to be Thursday. That's 4 days away. Yes. Elena could see he wasn't going to change his schedule just for her convenience. This man lived by his own rules, his own timeline. After breakfast, Jake showed her around the cabin. There was a small bedroom with a simple bed and dresser. A bathroom with basic plumbing that he explained ran on a well and septic system. A storage room packed with canned goods, tools, and equipment. "You really are prepared for anything," Elena said, looking at the shelves of supplies. "Being prepared keeps you alive." "What exactly are you preparing for?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "For whatever comes." It wasn't really an answer. But Elena was starting to understand that Jake only shared information when he wanted to. Outside, he showed her his workshop, a small building where he made furniture and repaired tools. Everything was organized and clean, every tool in its proper place. "You built all the furniture in the cabin?" Elena asked. Jake nodded. "Had to. Nearest furniture store is 200 miles away." "These are beautiful," Elena said, running her hand over a half-finished chair. "You're really talented." Jake looked uncomfortable with the compliment. "It's just woodworking." But Elena could see it was more than that. Each piece was carefully crafted, made to last. There was pride in this work, even if Jake wouldn't admit it. Behind the workshop was another small building that looked different from the others. Jake walked past it without explanation. "What's in there?" Elena asked. "Nothing important." But as they passed, Elena heard a soft chirping sound. She stopped. "Is that a bird?" Jake sighed. "Yes, can I see?" "It's just a hawk with a broken wing. Nothing interesting." But Elena was already walking toward the building. Jake followed reluctantly. Inside was a makeshift aviary. Perched on a wooden stand was a red-tailed hawk, beautiful but clearly injured. One wing was bandaged and held close to its body. "Oh my God," Elena whispered. "He's gorgeous." Jake corrected. "Found her 3 weeks ago." Wing was broken in 2 places. Elena watched as Jake approached the hawk calmly. The bird didn't seem afraid of him at all. In fact, she made a soft sound that almost seemed like greeting. "Hey, Red," Jake said quietly, offering the hawk a piece of meat from his pocket. "How's the wing today?" The tenderness in his voice was completely different from how he spoke to Elena. This was a man who cared deeply, despite his warnings about not being gentle. Will she be able to fly again? Elena asked. Maybe. Wings healing well, but you never know with breaks like this. Elena watched as Jake carefully examined the wing, his big hands incredibly gentle with the injured bird. Red seemed to trust him completely. Why do you help her? Elena asked. Jake looked surprised by the question. She was hurt. What else would I do? You could have left her. No, Jake said simply. I couldn't. That afternoon, Elena tried to make herself useful. She offered to help with cooking, cleaning, any chores Jake needed done. But he seemed more comfortable doing things himself. I'm not used to having help, he explained when Elena persisted. I'm not used to being useless, Elena replied. They compromised. Elena was allowed to help with cooking and washing dishes, but Jake handled everything else. It was clear he had routines, systems that worked for him, and he didn't want them disrupted. As evening approached, Elena found herself dreading bedtime. Where would she sleep? Jake had given her the couch last night, but that couldn't be a long-term arrangement. You can have the bedroom, Jake said, as if reading her thoughts. I'll take the couch. That's not fair. This is your home, and you're my guest. Guest gets the bed. For 2 weeks? Jake shrugged. I've slept in worse places. That night, lying in Jake's bed, Elena stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she'd been running from the biggest failure of her career. Now she was in a mountain cabin with a man who rescued injured hawks and made beautiful furniture with his hands. Her phone sat dead on the nightstand. For the first time in years, no one could reach her. No emails, no calls, no constant demands for her attention. It should have felt scary. Instead, it felt like relief. Through the thin wall, she could hear Jake moving quietly around the main room, banking the fire, checking locks, doing whatever he did before sleep. Elena realized she felt safe here. Despite his warnings, despite his scars and secrets, she trusted this man who'd taken her in from the storm. Maybe that made her foolish. Maybe she should be more afraid, but as sleep began to take her, Elena decided that sometimes trust was more important than fear. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, and the mountain kept its secrets. Part 4. Walls began to crack on the third morning. Elena woke up before Jake. She lay in bed listening to the complete silence outside. No car horns, no sirens, no rumble of city traffic, just birds singing and wind moving through pine trees. In Chicago, she was always rushing. Always late, always behind, always trying to catch up to some invisible deadline. Here, time moved differently, slower, more naturally. She got up and started coffee, trying to be quiet. But Jake appeared in the main room before the coffee finished brewing, already dressed and alert. You don't have to get up so early, Elena said. I always get up at sunrise. Body clock doesn't change just because there's someone else here. They ate breakfast in comfortable quiet. Elena was starting to understand that Jake wasn't much of a talker in the mornings. He needed time to wake up fully before conversation. After eating, Jake went out to check on Red while Elena cleaned up the dishes. When he came back, he was frowning. Something wrong? Elena asked. Her wing is swelling again. Might be infected. Elena could hear the worry in his voice even though he was trying to hide it. Can you give her antibiotics or something? I've got some, but if it gets worse, she might need a vet. Is there one nearby? Jake shook his head. Closest one is in town, and he's not exactly a wildlife specialist. Elena watched Jake pace around the cabin. For a man who seemed so calm and controlled, he was clearly upset about the hawk. She means a lot to you, Elena observed. Jake stopped pacing. She's just a bird. But Elena could see that wasn't true. Red wasn't just a bird to Jake. She was something he cared about, something that depended on him. Why don't you tell me about your job? Jake said suddenly, changing the subject. The one that was so important you drove through a storm to think about it. Elena sighed. She'd been dreading this conversation, but maybe it was time. I work in advertising. Worked anyway. I'm probably fired by now. What happened? Elena told him about the Peterson account, about the mistake in her presentation, about how $20 million had disappeared because she'd typed the wrong number in a PowerPoint slide. One number? Jake asked. One number. I was working 18-hour days, hadn't slept properly in weeks, and I made a stupid mistake that cost everyone their jobs. Everyone. My whole team got laid off. 12 people gone because of my screw-up. Jake was quiet for a moment. You didn't mean to make the mistake. Doesn't matter. Intent doesn't pay people's mortgages. So you ran. Elena nodded, feeling ashamed. I ran, got in my car and drove until it broke down. Where were you going? I don't know. Somewhere I could think. Somewhere I could figure out how to fix what I'd broken. Jake leaned back in his chair. Some things can't be fixed. That's a cheerful thought. It's a true thought. I spent a long time trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed. All it did was make everything worse. Elena looked at him carefully. What kind of things? Jake was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he stood up and walked to one of the bookshelves. He pulled out a photo that had been tucked between two books. The photo showed Jake in military uniform, standing with 3 other soldiers. They were all smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. Jake looked younger, happier, less guarded. Afghanistan, Jake said quietly. My unit. Elena studied the photo. You look different. I was different. What happened to them? Elena asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Roadside bomb. I was supposed to be in that vehicle with them, but I'd stayed behind to check coordinates on a map. 5 minutes. That's all it was. Elena felt her heart clench. Jake, they died because I wasn't there to do my job. Maybe if I'd been with them, I would have seen something, noticed something that would have saved them. Or maybe you would have died with them. Jake put the photo back between the books. Maybe that would have been better. Don't say that, why not? It's true. They had families, futures. Danny was going to marry his girlfriend when we got home. Carlos had twin girls he'd never met. Mike was going to start college, become a teacher. Elena could hear the pain in Jake's voice, pain that was still raw after all these years. And what about you? Elena asked gently. What were you going to do? I was a soldier. It's all I knew how to be, but you're more than that. Look at this place. Look at what you've built here. Jake shook his head. This isn't living. This is just existing. Elena felt a sudden urge to argue with him, to tell him he was wrong, but she could see that Jake believed what he was saying. Is that why you help Red? Elena asked. Because you couldn't help them? Jake's jaw tightened. Red is different. How? I can actually save her. They spent the rest of the morning in quieter conversation. Elena told Jake about her life in Chicago, about the pressure, the competition, the constant feeling that she was never doing enough. Jake listened without judgment, asking questions that made her think. Do you miss it? Jake asked. Elena considered this seriously. I miss the satisfaction of solving problems, of making deals work. But I don't miss the stress. I don't miss feeling like I was always one mistake away from losing everything. Sounds familiar. Is that how you felt? In the military? Jake nodded. Every day. One wrong decision, one moment of not paying attention, and people died. But that's not really living, is it? Being that afraid all the time? Jake looked at her with surprise, as if he'd never considered this before. That afternoon, Jake asked Elena to help him with Red. The hawk's wing was definitely more swollen, and she seemed less alert than before. What do you need me to do? Elena asked. Hold her while I clean the wound? She trusts you now. Elena was surprised. She trusts me? Birds can sense fear. You're not afraid of her anymore. Elena realized Jake was right. The first time she'd seen Red, she'd been nervous around the powerful bird. Now she approached calmly, speaking in soothing tones. Jake showed Elena how to hold the hawk securely but gently while he examined the wing. Red stayed calm, seeming to understand they were trying to help. There, Jake said after cleaning and rebandaging the wing. That should help with the infection. Elena was still holding Red, amazed at how light the bird felt despite her size. She's beautiful, Elena murmured. Wild things usually are, Jake said. When they're healthy. Elena looked up at him. Are you talking about the bird or yourself? Jake met her eyes for a moment, something unguarded flickering across his face. Then he looked away. We should let her rest, he said. That evening, as they sat by the fire reading, Elena found herself watching Jake instead of her book. He was reading something thick and philosophical, completely absorbed. Jake? Yeah? Thank you. For letting me stay, for taking care of me. I know this isn't easy for you. Jake closed his book and looked at her. It's not hard either. What do you mean? I mean, it's nice. Having someone to talk to. Someone who doesn't judge. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest. You don't judge either. You could have made me feel terrible about running away, but you didn't. We all run from things sometimes. Even you? Jake gestured around the cabin. What do you think this is? Elena looked around the comfortable room, at the books and handmade furniture, at the fire crackling peacefully. It looks like home to me, she said softly. Jake stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Outside, the wind picked up, reminding them both that the world beyond these walls was still cold and uncertain. But inside, something warm was beginning to grow between them, something that neither of them was quite ready to name. Part 5: The Storm. Within, Elena woke up on the fourth morning to the sound of Jake chopping wood outside. She looked through the bedroom window and saw him splitting logs with an axe, his movements precise and powerful. Even from inside, she could see the tension in his shoulders. When she went out to the main room, she found a note on the coffee table. Gone to get firewood. Back by noon. Jay. It was the first time Jake had left her alone since she'd arrived. Elena made coffee and sat by the fire, surprised by how quiet the cabin felt without him. She wandered around, looking at his books more carefully. Philosophy, psychology, military history, survival guides, but also poetry, classic literature, even some fiction. Jake was far more complex than he wanted people to think. On his desk, she found a notebook filled with his handwriting. Weather observations like he'd said, but also other notes, thoughts about the changing seasons, observations about wildlife, even some sketches of the mountains and trees around the cabin. One page caught her attention. It was dated 2 weeks ago before she'd arrived. Year 3, day 847. Saw a family of deer this morning. The fawn is getting bigger, almost ready for winter. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to have someone to share these moments with. Then I remember why that's a bad idea. Elena closed the notebook quickly, feeling like she'd invaded his privacy. But the words stuck with her. Jake was lonely, no matter what he said about preferring solitude. When Jake returned with a truck full of wood, he seemed different. More distant, like he was pulling back from the connection they'd been building. How's Red? Elena asked as he stacked wood by the fireplace. Fine, Jake said without looking at her. Just fine. Wing looks better. Infection's clearing up. Elena could tell something was bothering him, but she didn't know how to ask without pushing too hard. That afternoon, Jake disappeared into his workshop. Elena could hear him working, the sound of hammering and sawing. She tried to read, but she kept looking toward the workshop door. Finally, she decided to bring him some coffee. She found Jake bent over his workbench, carving details into a piece of wood. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something raw in his expression before he could hide it. Thought you might want some coffee, Elena said. Thanks. Jake took the mug but didn't stop working. Elena looked at what he was making. It was beautiful. A small jewelry box with intricate patterns carved into the lid. That's amazing, Elena said. Who's it for? Jake's hands stilled on the carving. Nobody. Just something to do with my hands, but Elena could see this wasn't true. The box was too carefully made, too personal to be just busy work. Jake, what's wrong? You've been different since this morning. Jake set down his carving tools and turned to face her. Elena, you need to understand something. He gestured between them. Whatever this is, it can't go anywhere. Elena felt her heart sink. Why not? Because you have a life to get back to. A career, a world that makes sense. And I have... He looked around the workshop. I have this. This is all I have, and that's not true. And yes, it is. I'm not good for you, Elena. I tried to warn you the first night. You're not the same man who warned me, Elena said firmly. That man was just scared. I've seen who you really are. Jake shook his head. You've seen what I want to be. There's a difference. Show me then, Elena said, stepping closer. Show me the man you think is so terrible. Jake's jaw tightened. You don't want to see that. Maybe I do. Maybe I need to see all of you to understand. For a moment, something dangerous flashed in Jake's eyes. Then he looked away. No, he said quietly. You don't. Elena reached out and touched his arm. Jake jerked away like her touch burned him. Don't, he said. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Make what harder? Letting you go when your car is fixed. Elena stared at him. Is that what you're planning? Just to let me go and pretend none of this happened? It's what's best for both of us. How do you know what's best for me? Jake turned back to his carving, dismissing her. I just do. Elena felt anger flare in her chest. That's not fair. You don't get to decide that for me. I'm not deciding anything. I'm just facing reality. The reality is that I care about you. Elena said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Jake's hands froze on his tools. Elena, I care about you, she repeated, stronger this time. And I think you care about me too. That's why you're scared. Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm not scared. I'm being practical. You're terrified, Elena said. You're terrified of letting someone get close because you think you'll lose them too. Because I will. Jake's voice was louder now, pain breaking through his control. Everyone I've ever cared about ends up hurt or dead. That's who I am, Elena. That's what I do. That's not what happened to your unit, and you know it. You don't understand what happened. Then tell me. Jake stared at her for a long moment, breathing hard. Then he walked past her toward the door. Jake, don't walk away from me. He stopped with his hand on the door handle. I should have stayed with them. Should have been in that vehicle. Instead, I was looking at a map because I thought I was smarter than everyone else. My arrogance got them killed. Your caution saved your life. My life wasn't worth saving. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. How can you say that? Because it's true. They were better men than me. Better soldiers, better friends. They deserved to come home. So did you. Jake opened the door. I'm going to check on Red. After he left, Elena stood alone in the workshop looking at the half-finished jewelry box. She could see now why Jake was making it. It wasn't just busy work. It was something beautiful, something hopeful, something he was afraid to give to anyone because that would mean admitting he cared. That evening, Jake barely spoke during dinner. He sat by the fire afterward, staring into the flames, lost in his own thoughts. Elena tried to read, but she kept glancing at him. She could see the war going on inside his head, the battle between wanting connection and fearing it. The box is for me, isn't it? Elena said finally. Jake looked up, startled. What, the jewelry box you're making? It's for me. Jake was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. I was going to give it to you when you left. Something to remember. Remember what? That someone cared about you. Really cared? Elena felt her heart break a little. Jake, but I realized that would be selfish. Giving you something to remember me by when what you really need is to forget this place and move on with your life. Elena closed her book and moved to sit on the couch next to him. What if I don't want to forget? You will. Give it a few months back in Chicago and this will all seem like a strange dream. Is that what you want? For this to be just a dream? Jake looked at her and Elena could see the truth in his eyes. No, it wasn't what he wanted, but it was what he thought he deserved. I want you to be safe, Jake said quietly. Safe from what? From me, from this life, from caring about someone who might not be here tomorrow. Elena reached out and took his hand. This time he didn't pull away. Jake, none of us know if we'll be here tomorrow. That's not a reason to not care about people. It is for me. Why? Because when you lose people you love, it breaks something inside you. And I'm already too broken to risk breaking more. Elena squeezed his hand. What if you're wrong? What if caring about someone could fix some of those broken pieces? Jake looked at their joined hands. What if I'm right? What if caring about you gets you hurt? Then that's my risk to take. Jake met her eyes and Elena saw the exact moment when his walls started to crack. Not break, not crumble, but develop small fissures that let light through. Elena, he said softly. I'm not going anywhere, Jake. Not yet. Your car will be fixed when it's fixed. Until then, I'm here. We're here. Together. Jake studied her face as if trying to memorize it. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who would run when things got complicated. Elena smiled. Already ran, remember? Right into a storm and straight to your door. Something that might have been hope flickered in Jake's eyes. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, promising another storm. But inside the cabin, something warm was finally beginning to bloom between them. Something that felt like the beginning of healing. Part 6. Crossroads. Elena woke up to bright sunlight streaming through the bedroom window and the sound of Jake's voice outside. But there was another voice too, one she didn't recognize. She got dressed quickly and went to the main room. Through the window, she could see Jake talking to a man in a mechanic's uniform next to a tow truck. Her car was loaded on the back of the truck, looking small and out of place against the mountain landscape. Elena's stomach dropped. Her car was fixed, which meant her time here was over. Jake came inside a few minutes later, his expression unreadable. That was Tom from the garage in town, Jake said. Your car's ready. Elena nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. How much do I owe? $1,200. Tom says you can pay him when you pick it up. $1,200. Elena barely heard the amount. All she could think about was leaving this place, leaving Jake. I guess I should call a taxi or something, Elena said. I'll drive you to town. Elena looked at him in surprise. In the week she'd been here, Jake hadn't left the mountain once. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. They had breakfast in awkward silence. Elena kept looking around the cabin, trying to memorize every detail. The way the morning light hit the bookshelves, the sound of the fire crackling, the coffee mug Jake had let her use every morning. After eating, Elena went to pack her few belongings. Her business clothes, now clean but still showing signs of her adventure through the forest. Her phone, which she'd barely thought about in days. Jake appeared in the bedroom doorway holding something wrapped in brown paper. This is for you, he said. Holding out the package, Elena took it and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was the jewelry box she'd seen him working on. It was even more beautiful finished, the wood polished to a warm glow, the carved patterns intricate and delicate. Jake, it's gorgeous. There's something inside. Elena opened the box. Nestled in the velvet lining was a small wooden carving of a hawk in flight, wings spread wide. It was red, captured perfectly in miniature. So you don't forget, Jake said quietly. Elena felt tears starting. I'm not going to forget any of it. Jake looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead he just nodded. An hour later, they were driving down the mountain in Jake's old pickup truck. Elena watched the cabin disappear behind the trees and felt like she was leaving part of herself behind. The town was bigger than Elena had expected, maybe 3,000 people, with a main street lined with small shops and restaurants. Jake parked in front of Tom's garage. Jake Henderson, Tom said, wiping his hands on a rag as they approached. Haven't seen you in town for months. Tom, Jake nodded. This is Elena, her car. Pleasure to meet you, Tom said to Elena. Your alternator was completely shot and the radiator had a crack. But she's running good as new now. Elena paid for the repairs and did a quick test drive. The car ran perfectly, purring like it was happy to be working again. When she got back, Jake was waiting by his truck, hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable in the small town setting. I should get going, Elena said. I've got a long drive ahead of me. Yeah. They stood there looking at each other, neither wanting to be the first to say goodbye. Elena, Jake started, then stopped. What? Nothing, just drive safe. Elena felt her heart breaking. After everything they'd shared, everything they'd felt, this was how it was going to end? With an awkward goodbye in a parking lot? Jake, this doesn't have to be. Elena's phone suddenly buzzed in her pocket. She'd forgotten she'd turned it on to call the garage. Now back in civilization, messages were flooding in. She pulled out the phone and saw dozens of missed calls and text messages. Her heart sank as she read the names, her boss, her assistant, co-workers, clients. I should take this, Elena said, seeing her boss's number calling again. Elena, thank God. Her boss Richard's voice was frantic.
Where the hell have you been?
I've been trying to reach you for a week. I'm sorry, Richard. My car broke down and I had no signal. Never mind that now. You need to get back here immediately. The Peterson deal is back on. Elena nearly dropped the phone. What? Peterson called yesterday. Turns out their financial team made the same mistake you did, but in the opposite direction. When they realized it, they saw that your original numbers were actually conservative. They want to double their investment. Elena stared at Jake, who was watching her with growing understanding. Richard, I don't understand. The mistake you thought you made? It wasn't a mistake. Your numbers were right. Peterson's people screwed up their analysis. They're so impressed with your accuracy that they want you to handle their entire West Coast expansion. Elena felt the world spinning around her. The West Coast expansion? $50 million, Elena, and they want you specifically. But there's a catch. They want to meet tomorrow morning. You need to be back here tonight. Elena looked at her watch. It was already noon. The drive to Chicago would take at least 12 hours. I'll be there, Elena heard herself say. Good. Oh, and Elena, the team you thought got fired. I called them all back yesterday. Turns out losing the Peterson account was the best thing that could have happened to us. Richard hung up, leaving Elena staring at her phone in shock. Good news? Jake asked, though his voice was flat. My job. The mistake I made. It wasn't actually a mistake. The client wants to work with me again. A bigger project. Congratulations. Elena could hear the distance in his voice already. He was pulling away, protecting himself from the goodbye he'd been dreading. Jake, this changes things. No, it doesn't. You have to go back. That's your life, your career. But what if I don't want to? Jake stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. Elena, this is what you've been working for. This is your chance to prove yourself, to get everything you wanted. Is it what I wanted? Or is it what I thought I was supposed to want? Jake was quiet for a moment. You won't know unless you go back and find out. Elena knew he was right, but it felt like her heart was being torn in half. What happens to us? There is no us, Elena. There's you, with your career and your future, and there's me, up on the mountain with my books and my isolation. It doesn't have to be that way. Yes, it does. Jake's voice was getting harder, more closed off. You've got 12 hours of driving ahead of you. You should go. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to fight for what they'd found together. But Jake was already walking back to his truck. Jake, wait! He stopped but didn't turn around. The hawk box, Elena said, holding up the wooden carving. What did you want me to remember? Jake was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft she barely heard him. That some things are worth caring about, even if you can't keep them. He got in his truck and drove away without looking back. Elena stood in the parking lot holding the wooden hawk, watching Jake's truck disappear around a corner. Part of her wanted to get in her car and follow him back up the mountain. Part of her wanted to drive straight to Chicago and pretend none of this had ever happened. Instead, she stood there at a crossroads, literally and figuratively, trying to figure out which direction led to the life she actually wanted. Her phone buzzed again. Another call from work, another reminder of the world that was waiting for her. Elena looked at the wooden hawk in her palm, then at the mountain road where Jake had disappeared, then at the highway that led back to Chicago. She had to make a choice. And she had to make it now. The question was, what did she really want? The career she'd worked so hard for, or the man who'd shown her what it felt like to be truly seen and cared for? Elena got in her car, started the engine, and sat there for a long moment, engine running, trying to decide which way to turn. The mountain road stretched ahead in one direction. The highway home stretched ahead in the other. Both led to completely different futures. Elena took a deep breath, put the car in drive, and made her choice. Part 7. The choice. Elena drove toward Chicago with tears streaming down her face. Every mile took her further from the mountain, further from Jake, further from the peace she'd found in that little cabin. She'd made the practical choice, the smart choice, the choice that everyone would understand, but it felt like the wrong choice. Her phone kept ringing. Richard called twice more with details about the Peterson meeting. Her assistant called with a list of things that needed to be handled immediately. Her mother called to ask why she hadn't returned anyone's calls for a week. Elena answered them all mechanically, saying the right things, making the right promises. Yes, she'd be there for the meeting. Yes, she was excited about the opportunity. Yes, she was fine, but she wasn't fine. She was falling apart. Around hour 6 of the drive, Elena pulled into a gas station to refuel. As she stood pumping gas, she looked at the wooden hawk carving sitting on her dashboard. Jake had made it for her, had spent hours carving every detail, every feather. Some things are worth caring about even if you can't keep them. That's what he'd said. But what if you could keep them? What if the only thing stopping you was fear? Elena's phone rang again. This time it was her best friend Lisa. Elena, where have you been? I've been worried sick. I'm fine, Lisa, just had some car trouble. Car trouble for a week? What happened? Elena found herself telling Lisa everything. About the storm, about Jake, about the week in the cabin, about falling for a man who lived alone on a mountain and carved beautiful things with his hands. Wait, Lisa interrupted. You fell in love with a mountain man? I didn't say I fell in love. You didn't have to. I can hear it in your voice. So what's the problem? Elena explained about the job offer, about having to choose between her career and... What? A man who'd already decided they had no future. Elena, Lisa said gently, when have you ever been happy at that job? The question hit Elena like a slap. What do you mean? I mean, every time we talk, you're stressed, exhausted, complaining about your boss or your workload or some client crisis. When's the last time you called me excited about work? Elena tried to think. She couldn't remember. But this Peterson deal could change everything, Elena said. It's everything I've worked for, is it? Or is it just more of the same stress with bigger numbers? Elena stood at the gas pump, phone pressed to her ear, watching traffic speed by on the interstate. Everyone rushing somewhere just like she'd been rushing for years. Lisa, I can't just abandon my career for a man I've known for a week. I'm not saying you should. I'm saying you should think about what actually makes you happy. And from what you just told me, it sounds like this past week was the happiest you've been in years. After Elena hung up, she sat in her car, staring at the highway ahead. 6 more hours to Chicago. 6 more hours to convince herself she was doing the right thing. But what if Lisa was right? When had she last been truly happy at work? When had she last felt the kind of peace she'd found with Jake? Elena picked up the wooden hawk and studied Jake's careful carving. Every detail was perfect. This wasn't something made by someone who didn't care. This was made by someone who cared deeply, maybe too much. Elena started the car and pulled back onto the highway. But now the voice in her head was asking different questions. Not what's the smart choice, but what do you actually want? 2 hours later, Elena's phone rang again. Richard, probably with more details about tomorrow's meeting. But when Elena looked at the caller ID, her heart stopped. It wasn't Richard. It was Jake. Elena pulled over immediately and answered, "Jake? Elena?" His voice was rough, like he'd been struggling with whether to call. "Where are you?" "About 4 hours out of Chicago. Why?" "I need to tell you something." Elena's heart started racing. "What?" "After you left, I went to check on Red. Her wing is completely healed. She's ready to fly." Elena felt tears starting again. "That's wonderful, Jake. She must be so happy. I let her go an hour ago." Opened the aviary door and watched her fly away. Elena didn't understand why he was telling her this. "I'm glad. That's what you wanted, right? For her to be free?" "I thought it was." But watching her fly away, Jake's voice cracked slightly. "It made me realize something." "What?" "Sometimes the biggest risk isn't caring about something you might lose. Sometimes the biggest risk is not fighting for something you've already found." Elena pulled her car completely off the road, her hands shaking. "Jake, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I was wrong. About us, about thinking you're better off without me. I'm saying that watching you drive away was the hardest thing I've done since I lost my unit." Elena felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "But my job? The meeting tomorrow? Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." "Okay. If money and career and other people's expectations weren't factors, if you could choose any life you wanted, what would you choose?" Elena closed her eyes. The answer came immediately without hesitation. "You," she whispered. "I'd choose you." "Then why aren't you?" Elena sat in her car on the side of the highway, phone pressed to her ear, and realized she didn't have a good answer. "Because it's crazy," she said finally. "Because I barely know you. Because you live on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. Those are reasons, not answers." "Elena, what do you want?" What did she want? Not what she thought she should want. Not what would look good on paper, but what she actually wanted. She wanted quiet mornings with coffee and conversation. She wanted to help care for injured animals. She wanted to watch Jake work with his hands, creating beautiful things from nothing. She wanted to curl up by a fire and read books and feel genuinely peaceful for the first time in years. She wanted Jake. "I want to come home," Elena said, and the words felt truer than anything she'd said in months. "Then come home." "But Jake, we need to talk about practical things. How would this work? What would I do for money? Where would I live?" "We'll figure it out together, but Elena, I need you to know something else." "What?" "I love you." Elena started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief. "I love you too." "Then turn around. Come back to me." Elena looked in her rearview mirror at the highway stretching back toward the mountains. Then she looked ahead toward Chicago, toward her old life, toward a future that looked exactly like her past. "Jake?" "Yeah? I'm coming home." Elena made a U-turn on the highway and started driving back toward the mountains. As she drove, she called Richard. "Elena, please tell me you're almost here." "Richard, I'm not coming back." "What?" "Elena, you can't be serious. This is the Peterson deal, I know, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. But I quit." "You quit?" "Elena, you're making a huge mistake." Elena looked at the wooden hawk on her dashboard, at the mountains growing larger ahead of her. No, she said. I'm finally making the right choice. She hung up and called Lisa. I'm driving back to him, Elena said without preamble. Good, Lisa said immediately. I was hoping you would. You think I'm crazy, I think you're brave. And I think you deserve to be happy. As Elena drove through the night toward the mountains, toward Jake, toward a future she couldn't predict, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt free. Like Red, finally ready to fly. Part 8. Finding home. Elena reached the mountain road at 2 a.m. Her heart was pounding as she drove up the winding path, her headlights cutting through the darkness between the pine trees. What if Jake had changed his mind? What if he regretted calling her? But when she pulled into the clearing, Jake was sitting on his porch steps waiting for her, as if he'd been there all night. Elena got out of her car and they stood looking at each other across the small distance between them. In the moonlight, Jake looked different, less guarded, more open. You came back, he said quietly. You asked me to. I wasn't sure you would. Elena walked toward him slowly. I wasn't sure either until I started driving away from you. Then I knew. Knew what? That I'd rather take a risk with you than play it safe without you. Jake stood up as she reached the porch steps. For a moment they just looked at each other, and Elena could see the wonder in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe she was really there. Then Jake reached out and pulled her into his arms, and Elena felt like she could finally breathe again. I love you, Jake murmured against her hair. I've never said that to anyone before. Never? Never meant it like this. They stood holding each other in the moonlight, and Elena felt something settle into place inside her chest. This was where she belonged. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of practical decisions. Elena had to go back to Chicago briefly to pack up her apartment and tie up loose ends. Jake came with her, looking completely out of place in the city but refusing to let her handle everything alone. It's so loud, Jake said as they walked down Michigan Avenue. Watching crowds of people rush past, you get used to it, Elena said, then realized she was wrong. Actually, no. I don't think I ever really got used to it. I just learned to ignore how much I hated it. Elena's co-workers threw her a goodbye party that felt more like a wake. Everyone kept asking if she was sure she knew what she was doing, throwing away her career for a man she barely knew. Only Lisa understood. Look at you, Lisa said, pulling Elena aside during the party. You're glowing. I haven't seen you this happy since college. I'm terrified, Elena admitted. I have no idea what I'm doing. Good. That means you're finally living instead of just surviving. Back at the mountain, Elena and Jake had to figure out how to build a life together. Elena had savings that would last a while, but she needed to find a way to make money long term. I could do freelance marketing consulting, Elena said one morning over coffee. Work with smaller companies who can't afford big agencies. I could do it remotely. Jake looked up from his notebook where he was sketching plans for expanding the cabin. Would that make you happy? Elena thought about it. Helping small businesses succeed? Actually, yes. It would be different from corporate consulting. More personal. Then we'll make it work. They spent the winter planning and building. Jake taught Elena basic carpentry skills, and she discovered she loved working with her hands. Together, they added a small office space to the cabin where Elena could work, and expanded the main room to make it more comfortable for 2 people. Elena's first client was the garage owner, Tom, who needed help marketing his business online. Then came a local restaurant, a small bookstore, and a craft brewery. Word spread, and soon Elena had more work than she could handle. I make less money than I did in Chicago, Elena told Jake one evening as they sat by the fire. But I'm doing work I actually care about with people I like. And I sleep 8 hours a night without nightmares about missing deadlines. Jake smiled. Sounds like success to me. Spring came early that year. One morning, Elena was working at her desk when she heard Jake calling her name excitedly from outside. She found him standing in the clearing, pointing up at the sky. Look, he said. High above them, a red-tailed hawk was circling the cabin. As they watched, the hawk let out a cry and soared higher, riding the wind currents with effortless grace. Is that Red? Jake said, wonder in his voice. She came back. They watched as Red made several more circles around the cabin before disappearing over the ridge toward the valley. She just wanted to say hello, Elena said. taking Jake's hand. Or thank you. For what? Jake looked at Elena with those gray eyes that had first intimidated her and now made her feel completely safe. For showing her it's possible to heal, and that sometimes the best thing about being free is choosing to come back to the people who care about you. That afternoon, Jake showed Elena something he'd been working on in secret. Behind the cabin, he'd built a small workshop addition with large windows and good lighting. It's for you, Jake said. I know you love books, and I thought maybe, if you wanted, you could start a small publishing company, help local authors get their stories told. Elena stared at the beautiful space perfectly designed for her needs. Jake, this is incredible. But how did you know I'd been thinking about that? Because you light up when you talk about the books you love. And because you have good instincts about stories. You saw something in my story worth saving. Elena felt tears starting. No one had ever known her well enough to anticipate her dreams like this. I have something for you too, Elena said. She led him to the main cabin and pulled out a folder she'd been hiding in her desk. Inside were the papers to make Jake's property officially wildlife-friendly land, protected from development. I've been working with a lawyer in town, Elena explained. This ensures that the land will always be a safe place for animals like Red. And there's a small grant program for people who do wildlife rehabilitation. Jake stared at the papers. Elena, this is... I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me help you save more injured animals. Jake pulled her into his arms. We're good together, aren't we? We're perfect together. 1 year later, Elena's small publishing company had released its first book, a collection of nature essays by local writers. Jake had successfully rehabilitated 3 more injured birds and was being consulted by the state wildlife department. They'd found a rhythm to their life. Mornings were for coffee and quiet conversation. Days were for work. Elena at her computer, Jake in his workshop or caring for animals. Evenings were for cooking together, reading by the fire, and talking about everything and nothing. Elena's family had finally visited, and despite their initial skepticism, they could see how happy she was. You were right, Elena's mother said as they stood on the porch looking out at the mountains. This place suits you. Jake suits me, Elena corrected. Him too. I've never seen you so peaceful. That evening, as Elena and Jake sat by their fire reading, Elena looked around the cabin they'd built together and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Jake? Do you ever regret it? Letting me stay that first night? Jake looked up from his book and smiled. Best decision I ever made. Even though I disrupted your hermit lifestyle? Elena, I was never a hermit. I was just a man who was afraid to let anyone matter to him. You didn't disrupt my life. You gave me one. Elena set down her book and moved to sit next to Jake on the couch. I love you. I love you too. More than I thought I could love anyone. Outside, an owl called through the darkness and the mountain held them in its peaceful embrace. Elena had learned that home wasn't a place, it was a person. It was finding someone who saw all your broken pieces and loved you anyway. Someone who challenged you to be braver, kinder, more honest with yourself. Someone who made you want to stay when your first instinct was to run. Jake? Yeah? I'm not going anywhere, ever. Jake tightened his arms around her. Promise? Promise. And as the fire crackled peacefully beside them, Elena knew she had finally found what she'd been searching for without even knowing it. Not success, not achievement, not other people's approval. She'd found home, in a cabin on a mountain, with a man who'd warned her he wasn't gentle but had turned out to have the gentlest heart she'd ever known. Some risks, Elena had learned, were worth taking. Some love stories were worth fighting for. And sometimes, the best adventures began when you stopped running from your fears and started running toward the person who made you feel brave enough to try.